So tip number 10 is use GitHub. Learn how to use Git to save your code, share it with others, and version control. This will help make sure that your prized possession, your asset you've been working on, is secure, and you can get back any mistakes you've made. And you can get back any code if you've made a mistake. So tip number 9 is think about how you can reuse your code, how you can make it into a library so that you're not writing the same code twice. There's lots of different ways to do that. You can do that with the Arduino IDE, create a library and upload that. Or if it's something like Python, you can look at using pip, and that means you can share it with other people. So tip number 8 is always write comments in your code, but not too many, just enough to remind you what the function is about or the specific line of code. The best practice really is to make your code so it's readable, so that you can understand it without any comments. But sometimes you write code and then you want to come back to it much later on. So comment, but not too many. Tip number 7. Write function tests for all your new functions. This will help make sure that there's no new bugs introduced when you're writing code and if you tweak them later. It also means that you're building up a library of tests so that you can run them. If you're checking into something like GitHub, you can get it to automatically run these tests. So write your little unit tests. They can be simple assertions, it doesn't have to be anything too complicated to begin with, but the better quality tests you write, the better that your code will be quality-wise. So tip number 6 is Learn Agile. This is the framework that's used by a lot of professional coders, and ultimately it's just about having a backlog of features and working through those one increment at a time, releasing your code every time you've got to a stable point. Phew, so tip number 5 is share your code. Use something like GitHub to share your code with other people, tell them about it, let them know that it's there. GitHub will also scan your code for vulnerabilities or any dependencies that you might have in there. But it's also a way of sharing your code with other people, being able to point to it in a discussion group if you're having some trouble with it. It's much easier for people to help you out if that's the case. So share your code and tell people about it. So tip number 4 is be concise and consistent with your variable names and functions. This will make it much easier for you to read later on when you're coming back to your code, and particularly if you're sharing this with other people. So things like snake case or camel case, there's some examples on the screen at the moment. These can help you understand what the function does by spacing out the naming better. And another practice is to be concise with the name. So MF wouldn't be a good example of a function name, whereas move robot forward one step would be far too verbose of a name and would be quite cumbersome to type that out. So there's a kind of Goldilocks middle zone where you get the name just right, the right size. So concise is the key there. So be consistent and concise with your naming, and your code will be much easier to read. So tip number 3 is if you're stuck with a problem and you're trying to solve something and you can't figure out how to do it, try looking at different languages. What you might find is if there's an easier language to learn, such as Python, it's easier to solve the problem in that language than it is in the language that you're currently using, such as the Arduino, which is a C variant. So if you can solve the problem in one language, it makes it a lot easier then to sort of convert it back to the language that you're having trouble with. I certainly do this with Python. I'll try something out because I'm familiar with it. I understand how to get that to work, and I get the answer that I'm happy with. So tip number 2 is don't give up. Programming is really hard, and there'll be times when you can't find the solution to the thing that you're trying to solve. So the best thing to do is just get up away from the keyboard, think about something else, do something mundane, a chore or something like that. And I usually find that my mind will come up with a solution all by itself. So tip number 1 is have fun. This is what it's all about at the end of the day. If you're not having fun, do come find another hobby, I would say. Coding is really rewarding. When you get your code finally running and doing something properly, bringing your robot to life, issuing commands that you wrote, there's nothing more rewarding. It's really satisfying. And as a bonus tip, make it work, make it right, and make it fast, in that order. So don't worry about making really efficient code to begin with or really elegant code. Just make the thing work first of all. After you've made it work, that's when you start looking at building your tests. That's when you start to make it right, as it were. So you might, correctly name your variables. You might make the code much more readable, adding some comments, getting rid of comments that were all code that didn't work, getting rid of debug statements, that kind of thing. And then after you've made it right, then you can start looking at efficiencies and making the whole thing faster and looking at reuse. So make it work, make it right, and make it fast. And those are my top 10 programming tips.